Every time I tell this story, I feel my spirit lift up inside of me. This is the story of a man who didn't just walk through life, he ran through it. And we have to ask ourselves, what would it take for us to do that? What would it take for us to really run through life? To not just accept all of our scars and all of our flaws, but to embrace them and make them our own. Because when we do, we can dominate life like the main character. So without further ado, let us get into today's episode of our series, where we break down some of the greatest stories ever told. This is the story of Dennis Rodman. Part 1. The Rebellious Warrior. To understand Dennis, we have to look at his ordinary world. He grew up poor with a broken family. His parents divorced when he was just 7 years old. And so he went back and forth between his mom and his dad, never really feeling like he belonged anywhere. But maybe that's where his wild spirit came from, his feeling of being rejected and unwanted, which led him to acting out, getting suspended from school, and eventually dropping out completely. So he was never good at sitting still or listening to authority, and that's how he became a problem. But he had a gift, an athletic gift. He played basketball in high school, and soon enough he got a scholarship in college. But then, a horrible thing happened. He lost his mother right before he was about to play his first game in college. So now he was alone. Nobody wanted him. He didn't belong anywhere. And that led to him having a nervous breakdown. And soon after, he attempted to take his own life. So he went to the abyss. But something amazing happened because he found love. He found love from his teammates and coaches. They were there for him during his darkest moment. And that gave him a reason to live. That gave him a reason to keep going, to be reborn. And that's what he did. He came back to the team and started dominating, leading them to 2 straight conference championships and making himself a legend at the college. And that led him to being drafted by the Detroit Pistons. He made it to the NBA. He was living his dream, but soon enough, he was fighting with his coach. And once again, he was acting out. He got suspended multiple times and almost got kicked out of the league, and that's why no one wanted him. But here's the thing. When someone has a gift, when someone has a talent, and when they find their purpose in life, there's nothing that can stop them. There's nothing that can hold them back. And that was true for Dennis. He was too gifted to stay down for long. So he kept bouncing back. And soon enough, he was traded to the San Antonio Spurs. And finally, he had a coach who believed in him, who trusted him, and who gave him the opportunity to show the world what he could do. And that's exactly what he did. Dennis was a force of nature. He dominated every single game, grabbing more than 20 rebounds per game and blocking shots like crazy. In fact, he became the NBA's all-time leader in total rebounds and offensive rebounds. He was also named Defensive Player of the Year and made the NBA's all-defensive first team an incredible 8 times. And in the end, he won 2 championships with the Pistons and 1 with the Spurs. In other words, he dominated the game like nobody else. He was a beast. And that's because he had found his purpose. You see, his childhood taught him to be tough. It taught him to fight. It taught him to embrace his scars. And that's what he did. Became the most ferocious defender in the history of the game. But that wasn't all. Dennis also became known as one of the greatest characters in sports history. You see, while everyone feared his defense, they also loved watching him play. And that's because Dennis brought chaos onto the court. He was unpredictable. Sometimes he would grab the ball and charge full speed towards the basket. Other times he would block shots with ease. Sometimes he would just dive into the crowd to grab a loose ball. In fact, one time he jumped into the stands and grabbed a fan's drink. Dennis was passionate. He loved the game. And he showed that every single time he stepped onto the court. But that also meant that he wasn't afraid to show emotion. He wasn't afraid to celebrate his victories and scream at the referees or the opposing players. And that's why people loved him. People loved his passion. They loved his energy. However, there were also people who hated him. In fact, Dennis made more enemies than friends. He had beefs with everyone, from Michael Jordan to Magic Johnson to Shaquille O'Neal. And that's because Dennis wasn't afraid to speak his mind. He wasn't afraid to call out other players or coaches or even the commissioner of the NBA. In fact, once he dyed his hair bright red and pointed it towards the commissioner and shouted, "You're fired." And that brings us to the climax of Dennis's story, his legacy. Like I said, Dennis was fearless. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind and stand up for what he believed in, even if that meant going against the entire world. That's why people either loved him or hated him. There was no in between. Here's the thing, Dennis wasn't perfect. He had his flaws. He struggled with addiction, and he struggled with relationships. But despite all that, he became one of the greatest players in NBA history. He became a 5-time All-Star and won 2 Olympic gold medals with the U.S. national team. Now, here's the question. What does Dennis's story teach us? What can we learn from a man who dominated the game like nobody else? Well, I think Dennis teaches us that we shouldn't just accept our scars and our flaws, we should embrace them. We should use them to our advantage. That's what makes us unique. That's what makes us who we are. That's what allows us to dominate life like the main character. See, Dennis wasn't afraid to be himself. He wasn't afraid to show emotion. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind. That's why he became such a legendary player. People loved him. They loved his passion. They loved his energy. And sure, there were people who hated him, but who cares? Dennis didn't care. He was too busy dominating the game and living life on his own terms. That's what we have to remember. That's what we have to strive for. We have to find our purpose. We have to find what we're passionate about, and we have to pursue it with everything we've got. Because that's what Dennis did. And in the end, he became a legend. Now here's the thing. When we talk about Dennis Rodman, we often focus on his flaws, on his mistakes, on his personal problems. But that's not the whole story. Yeah, Dennis struggled with a lot of things, but he also accomplished a lot of amazing things. He helped the Spurs win a championship. He was named Defensive Player of the Year. He was a 5-time All-Star. He's in the Hall of Fame. And yeah, sure, he made a lot of enemies, but he also made a lot of friends. He had a great sense of humor. He was always smiling. He was always joking around, and he loved life. He loved it with all his heart. And that's what we have to remember about Dennis. He was a warrior. He was a fighter. He was a survivor. And he was also a winner. He proved that no matter what we go through in life, no matter what obstacles we face, we can overcome them. We can succeed. We can become anything we want to be. We just have to believe in ourselves. We have to have faith in ourselves. We have to never, ever give up. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.